Hello, thank you all so much for joining us to discuss Doran Larson's new book, Inside Knowledge: Incarcerated People on the Failures of American Prison. I want to firstly thank the Mellon Foundation and NYU Press for their partnership, as well as all of the NYU staff supporting this event, including the AV and facilities team, for making tonight possible. And thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us today. Tonight's event will begin with a conversation between Dr. Doran Larson and Dr. Elizabeth Alexander. Doran Larson is the Edward North Professor of Literature at Hamilton College. He led a writing workshop inside Attica Correctional Facility for 10 years and has organized 2 college programs inside New York State prisons. He is the author of Witness in the Era of Mass Incarceration, published in 2017, editor of Fourth City Essays from Prison in America, published in 2014, and he founded and now co-directs the Mellon-funded American Prison Writing Archive, housed at prisonwitness.org. Elizabeth Alexander is a poet, scholar, and cultural advocate who currently serves as president of the Mellon Foundation. She has held distinguished professorships at Yale and Columbia Universities and previously served as the director of creativity and free expression at the Ford Foundation. An author or co-author of 15 books, she is a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and has been recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people. I will now pass it over to Dr. Alexander and Dr. Larson.
Well, hello. It's wonderful to be with you, and wonderful to be with you all, and wonderful to get a chance to talk about this book, your work, and as we were saying when we spoke earlier, the thousands of lives and stories that are in the book. So really, really glad to have a chance to do this tonight. And so wanted to start by asking you, you're a scholar, well, you're a scholar of Greek, so I want to kind
I
of.
carry the title of a scholar of Greek. This book's
Okay.
around. I'm not making those claims.
Okay, well, and a scholar of the American carceral system, and a teacher within it, and an organization builder within it. And you've published widely on prison issues, and led the Attica Writers Workshop for many years. And so I wanted to know the long story of what led you to this work, the whole story.
In some sense, can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. In some sense, the real story is not what got me started, but why I stayed. It was really just sort of dumb chance that I got involved in prison work. There was a fellow who was part of a group that went into Attica with folks from the outside to sit in a circle and talk to incarcerated people about coping with being in prison. I met him, he invited me to come in. So I was part of that group for 2 or 3 weeks. Then my teaching schedule changed and I couldn't participate anymore. So I proposed a writing class and started at that point. And what kept me in was the fact that a real core of men, 3 of whom are here tonight, kept coming back week after week, over the course of those years. If people had just come in, 1 week, dropped out, there'd not been a consistent core, I don't know that I would have gone back in. But then having read their work, as a literary critic, I became interested in the genre. And I also wanted to teach an undergraduate course on American prison writing, but there was no broad sampling of currently incarcerated people, nonfiction about their experience. So I put together, with the assistance of several student interns, the book came out in 2014, Fourth City Essays from Prison in America, 71 essays from 27 states. And the thing that became clear in doing Fourth City was the fact that, for example, in the first 45 essays, they fell into 11 really clear categories. So even though this work was coming from all across the country, it was representing a population whose testimony had the coherency of what you would expect from, a survey of life in LA or Chicago or New York. And it was just remarkable to me that there was so much coherency, in that body of work. The deadline for that book passed, and work just kept coming. And we'd had a previous Mellon Foundation grant to initiate digital humanities projects, and that's what created the American Prison Writing Archive. That then led to the monograph that was mentioned, and this book, Inside Knowledge, was really taking the archive into a next step in presenting the work in a really focused way.
Mhm,
You know, it has 4 chapters. They look at particular failures of the American prison.
mhm,
And there are many, many failures of civic structures that are in the book. But this one was really about, you know, leveling the myths about what it actually is supposed to achieve, even by the prison's own standards,
mhm,
right? So again, it was really what kept me going.
mhm,
And it was the consistency of the work and the insistence of incarcerated people to tell their stories,
mhm,
right? And that's what's kept me in over the course of these years.
mhm. And when you started, when you went to that first workshop, what were you teaching? What were you writing about? What were you thinking about?
I'd been teaching writing for 23 years at that point.
Mhm,
It was very open, so people could write fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama. Um, what happened was that over the course of, I would say, 3 to 5 years, the men in the class developed enough trust in me and each other to start actually writing about their experience inside,
mhm,
which is not a safe thing always to do,
mhm,
because these are institutions that are built on censorship, right? They don't want the words from inside getting
mhm,
outside. But once that trust was established, and I'd also, I would often say, um, because men would say, why does anyone want to listen to what I have to say? I said, because you are absolutely the front line experts on this institution, because you've been through it. And clearly that is what the world outside is going to give you more credence for.
mhm,
And I can probably, help to get this in print. So that was a motivator,
mhm,
but that ceased to really be a motivator, or secondary rather, to simply being able to present their stories,
mhm.
right? And talk about that experience.
Mhm. And then even, in teaching writing with the examples of literature that you would give in your class,
Mhm.
or most people don't go inside, really is my actual real question.
Yeah.
Trying to most people aren't interested in putting together bibliographies of, prison literature. More so now. So I think
Mhm.
also what's interesting is that your work itself and also the time period of your work, we've seen the conversation change so much
Right.
about interest in, in teaching inside and incarceration and, all of these matters. But I want to really kind of understand, even at the deeper beginning, why do you think you chose to do that teaching?
Um, well, I teach at a very exclusive college.
Mhm,
It's very expensive.
mhm,
And when I came to Hamilton, it's a great school. We produce incredible students. They're really, really dedicated to their work. But I'd been teaching and had all of my education in state universities. And I hadn't realized until I came to a private college the extent to which my motivation for teaching was in watching people's lives be transformed.
mm,
That when I taught in the University of Texas at San Antonio or in a small college in the Wisconsin system, I knew that those students weren't in that room. They were probably going to be working at 7-Eleven for the rest of their lives, right?
mhm,
Or some sort of other kind of job.
mhm.
Though I love teaching at Hamilton, the stakes were different,
Yeah.
right, at that point. And so when I, in the midst of that, stumbled into the prison work, it gave me back that sense that I was
Mm,
giving it to someone, to folks who really needed,
mhm,
what I was teaching,
mhm,
and that I could make the skills that I had, in some sense, move beyond academia,
mhm,
right, into, an institution that is, all about, again, just sort of, secreting people away,
mhm,
right? And not letting us see them and understand them. So
mhm,
that was motivation. Yeah.
mhm,
There's
mhm.
some deeper personal things that have to do with, my first memories in life are of being inside an institution, in which most people, see it as a benevolent institution. We all think it's a good institution that we should all have, but it also caused an enormous amount of pain. And that was a hospital when I was very,
Mm,
very young.
mhm,
And I've often said, I've been in many prisons around the world. I've seen many things that I didn't expect, but I've never been in a space that did not feel familiar at some level.
huh,
And so that I wasn't aware of that really until I started working in prisons. The
wow.
extent to which that experience was still sort of ingrained
Mhm,
in my thinking and mind and
mhm.
emotions, most importantly.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And then, more about, you write your book, The Stories Keep Coming. And then there's the archive, which is, what is it, 50 million words, 5 million words?
5 million.
5 million,
yeah,
okay,
we're getting
100
there.
zillion million words. But I
We're
mean,
trying to get
it's, there's a lot of words.
Yeah.
So what is it about like kind of bookness that made you think, I need to go back? This archive isn't gonna do the complete job. I need to go back and work with it in book form.
Yeah, the motivation was really understanding that, from the secondary work that I'd done and being a citizen of the United States, that policy and practice changes when public attitudes change.
Mm-hmm,
Major part of building mass incarceration was a radical change in the public image of incarcerated people. And, you can see this through the popular representation from, Cool Hand Luke,
yeah,
and the Defiant Ones
Yeah.
and, Perry Mason,
yes,
as being our heroes to, the early 70s and the Dirty Harry movies come out.
yep,
And you have a cop who's blowing holes through people before they even get to the court system
yep,
because people think the Warren Court years, made it too easy for incarcerated people to get out.
yeah,
With the rise of the Black Power movement and also a spate of serial killers in the early
Mhm.
70s, suddenly transformed the public image of incarcerated people as people that had rough lives. And
mhm,
if they got help, they could, come back out and be productive citizens. The people who just needed to be caged for as long as possible.
mm,
And I know that if that image can be changed, then, that would be, a big part of
mhm,
moving practice.
mhm,
And that was part of the motivation for writing this particular book.
mhm. Yeah, in thinking about narrative change or changing the image, and that's fascinating how you go through and chart the films kind of against the national politics. Can you talk more about belief in and evidence that people's opinions can change? How do you see that happening?
Well, I'll give you the example. One of my two brothers read Inside Knowledge,
Mm-hmm,
and he said, he said something I thought is probably typical for many readers. I just thought these were a bunch of bad people
mm,
who needed to be kept locked up.
mm-hmm,
I had no idea where they came from, what was being done to them, right? Because the prison has been very, very successful in
mm-hmm,
selling itself as a socially constructed institution
mm-hmm,
when it's never been. The opening chapter of the book looks at the
Mhm.
fact this institution has been a fraud from the beginning. It has never done what it's claimed to do.
mm-hmm,
And no one has ever really tried to look inside and really take seriously what incarcerated people have to say, people
Mhm.
on the receiving end of all these systems.
mhm,
And I think that had been the case over the course of years. I don't know if the institution would have even continued. In the
mhm,
late 60s, most people who looked at the problem said they thought prisons are just going to disappear.
mhm,
Everybody who looked at it said they're not working, right? They're criminogenic. But the politics changed drastically at that point. And again,
mhm,
in many ways, is the backlash against the civil rights movement,
mhm,
right? In which, rather than, or rather, coding Black Power, civil rights, the rebellions that were taking place as all sort of, civil unrest
mhm,
and switching the conversation from rights to criminality,
mhm,
right? And we need to turn that history around.
mhm,
And I think incarcerated people not only are capable of leading us out of that attitude toward incarcerated people,
mhm,
but given their experience, particularly the aggregate of their experience, of the
mhm,
failures of so many civil systems, civil structures, the economics, the politics,
mhm,
I think they're actually our best bet for leading us toward a much more democratic and inclusive society,
mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm,
Rather than seeing them as as a national deficit, as a really, really rich resource
mhm,
for understanding where we should be.
mhm, mhm. What do you think about, having taught specifically at Attica, the whole role that journalism has played in putting forward a lot of these images? I'm thinking about when you mentioned serial killers, how serial killers are covered, the drama of the way that, I mean, we can think of any number of
Right.
different examples. I grew up in the DC area, so, the DC sniper and will he be
Right.
caught, and everybody, journalism contributes to a lot of that as well. And I think what's so interesting about Attica and its history is that the Attica uprising was something that, as it was covered, made the place a symbol
Mhm.
for, this is what happens when, people inside, rebel and it's dangerous to others.
Mhm.
But, either there were some people who knew differently all along, but to Stanley Nelson's documentary,
Uh-huh.
which I thought was, amazing and showed so much footage that I don't think had been shown widely
No, I don't
before.
think so, yeah.
So what about journalism as a narrative space?
Well, the issue with journalism is the problem with journalism, right? Insofar as much of it is market driven,
Mm-hmm,
and it's often appealing to preconceived notions.
mm-hmm,
And Attica is a great example in the sense that, famously the initial reports, right, were that all the corrections officers, hostages, had been killed by incarcerated people. The
mm-hmm,
autopsy showed that that is not the case. They've been shot by their own colleagues.
mm-hmm,
Sent over 2,000 rounds into a
mm,
fog of tear gas
mm,
on that yard. But it also became a marker for an understanding of the incredible deprivations that were taking place inside that
mm-hmm,
institution. And that, spawned a whole other, I mean, along with, of course, the Vietnam War is going at the same time,
mm-hmm,
a different kind of journalism, right? That was ready to talk to the people on the ground,
mm-hmm,
right? And bring that forward. And remarkably now, and John J. Lennon, who was one of the members of the
mm-hmm,
class at Attica, has turned himself into a journalist working from inside.
mm-hmm,
And he's done, some really, really wonderful work there, as well as the other men, in the class and some in this room, other books, and just really doing, journalism from the ground up,
mm-hmm,
as it were. And so, uh, I think, journalists, of course, do, crucially important work. But it also has to be work that, editors want to see and
mm-hmm,
want to put out. I would like to bypass journalism, for all of its virtues,
mm-hmm,
by making the testimony in incarcerated people be so valued
mm-hmm,
that it doesn't have to attend to markets.
mm-hmm,
I think that the work that we're doing should ideally be
mm-hmm,
handled by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, right?
mm,
Your job is
yeah,
basically to give us the only way that we have checks and balances on incarceration is to take seriously and record the testimony of incarcerated people,
mm-hmm,
right? Now, we have generous support from the Mellon Foundation, and your work, obviously, in the whole Imagining Freedom, has really taken the place of, I think, and done the work that I think civil institutions should be doing. But of course, they're not going to, right?
mm-hmm,
They're protecting the system as it were.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what about also thinking about the word literature and about the prison literature that you talk about, let's say Malcolm X being, perhaps one of the greatest examples, but, so many works, Lesson Before Dying or American Marriage, and you give us many, many examples of that. How do you think about the literature as such, right? Made by people who are writers all day long, right? And what is the sort of conversation or coming together of all of the writing and stories that you're talking about?
Right. Well, I mean, the sort of traditional ideas of literature,
Mhm.
those were, that boat got rocked,
Yeah.
seriously in the 80s, and
Mhm.
it's not going to settle down.
Woohoo, ladies.
We're very thankful, for that. But I don't think that that has necessarily affected the markets and the publishers who put the work out,
Mhm.
right? They, publishers are challenged these days, as you know. Even the small nonprofits, as heroic as the work is that they do, they
Mhm.
have to watch out for their own survival.
Mhm.
And so in many ways, the books that really survive are the ones that get assigned, frankly, in classrooms, right? So they have this steady market, places that
Mhm.
they go. And the work is different. I mean, we really need different standards for understanding, what it is that quote unquote stands as literature. I don't
Mhm.
know, there should be a category which is just, this is literature and this is not in some way. But I think the value of, well, actually making comparison, but clarify this. when we think about the writing of formerly enslaved people,
I was gonna hope you would go there. Yeah,
think
yeah.
about the writing of Holocaust memoirs,
Mm-hmm,
or we think about the transcripts from Truth and Reconciliation, right? We don't put literary standards on that.
mm-hmm,
We literally treat that work as literally as part of there's a kind of sacredness about this.
mm-hmm,
If someone found a previously undiscovered slave narrative,
mm-hmm,
we wouldn't read it and say it's not good enough.
mm-hmm,
This would be documented, right? This would be a valued text. A short poem found in the pocket of someone who went through the Holocaust, this would be recorded, right? We would value that. I think that the writing of incarcerated people should have exactly that value.
mm-hmm,
And obviously you can't completely flatten the understanding that one group of people was oppressed because of who they were, as
mm-hmm,
opposed to what they've done. But in terms of the way the criminal legal system works in this country,
mm-hmm,
people are largely incarcerated because of who they are,
mm-hmm,
right? Not because necessarily because of what they've done,
mm-hmm,
because we criminalize things that other countries just don't criminalize,
mm-hmm,
and we exacerbate or we lengthen sentences on one group of people and not on others,
mm-hmm,
right? So that difference, I think, is largely flattened between those categories. It's problematic, as some people might find that statement.
mm-hmm,
And I think we ought to put it in that category
mm-hmm.
rather than comparing it to, does this, compare to the literary canon, as it were.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so then to push a little bit on, I mean, obviously in full agreement with the value of stories per se, the value of testimony per se, the value of the artifact per se, because how else will we know how human beings are living and who they are? I mean, that's a given, but the autobiography, Frederick Douglass's narrative is because of its figurative language, but like it is a book above many books, right? And so, it's not to me about better or worse. It's about how do you think about, and by the way, also, I think that sometimes when people are at the bone of narrating their experience, that is actually often when we see figurative language, coming forward in extremely vivid ways. But
Sure.
so I'm thinking about questions of language and what like arrests you, to say like, I will never forget how this was put because of how it was written.
Right. That certainly occurs in this work.
Yep.
There's, just really, really beautiful, moving writing. And there's certainly, when you're reading in the archive, since our default position is we take everything, unless there's some reason for us not to include it. And in terms of, even using, traditional literary standards, there's some work that it's just beautiful. It feels as though this person has a deep awareness of themselves as writers, rather than simply writing out of a profound desperation, right? And literally just sort of sending a note, trying to get out beyond the wall, and trying to, in some sense, just feel as though they communicated with someone, forgetting any kind of tropes or any kind of, literary standards. So are those differences. But as I say, I think the whole category of writing by incarcerated people should shift in terms of how we compare it to other bodies of work. But we can certainly have, literary standards that we bring to that work. And I think that the really what feels like the most literarily beautiful work often comes not from writers who seem as though they've worked and polished that work, but who are making the most sort of adventurous attempts to articulate what, in many sense, can't be fully articulated, right? So they have to reach farther to try to, a different metaphor, a different kind of simile, a different kind of rhythm, literally in their sentences, to try to convey what that experience is.
I think that's something that that we see in the book that I'm really interested in is what does it mean? Like, what is prison writing? What does it mean to write about? Right? Like, what about people who want to write from inside about an earlier point in their lives, about, you know, people they're connected to on the outside, about something that they might be dreaming about, you know, something
Mhm.
that is in the imagination even.
Yeah.
How do you think about the freedom actually to pull forth all that is within?
Right. There was uh, a sort of cluster of work that came out of the workshop that was published in the Minnesota Review, the
Mhm.
journal. And I wrote an introduction for it. And the title of the introduction was The Prison Industrial Literary Complex.
Hmm.
And it's the idea that incarcerated people have no credibility except in writing about incarceration.
Mm.
So that they could be, you know, the finest short story writer, you know, working today,
Mhm.
but someone's going to see this is just prison writing, right? Or
Mm.
just prison writing, right? In
Mhm.
that way. So I think that there is that. They stand at a disadvantage in that way. And I know literary journals, you know, editors I've spoken to, they get a lot of work from
Mhm.
incarcerated people.
Mhm.
So it tends to sort of go into this category, oh, yes, one more, without
Mhm.
really being read in the way that it should be. At
Mhm.
the archive, because our focus and my focus in the beginning is to create a witness literature,
Mhm.
we do only take work that has some relationship to criminal legal system involvement, right?
Mhm.
And I understand the limits of that, right?
Mhm.
But, you know, we can only do so much. And there are
Mhm.
other sites that do other things. You know, the Penn Prison Writing Program
Sure,
has
yeah.
categories for poetry, and we take poetry as well,
Mhm.
fiction, drama, etc. But the reason that I put that restriction on it was that people are so skeptical about the writing of incarcerated people that it's all self-interested, or they're trying
Hmm.
to, you know, work their way out of something.
Yeah.
That I didn't want there to be ambiguity about whether or not someone was fictionalizing something,
Mhm.
because that skepticism was already built, you know, in the
Mhm.
general public mind.
Mhm.
Right.
Was the sorting ever hard? I mean, you know, where in reading a piece of work where more than one thing is happening?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to clarify, qualifying for us
Mhm.
is, you know, if somebody says if somebody writes a great story about fishing with a parent,
Mhm.
and it makes no mention of criminal legal system
Mhm.
involvement, then we won't take it. We'll
Yeah.
report it. We'll tell, you know, inform them about other places that it might go.
Mhm.
But if it says at the beginning, this is what I think about in solitary confinement, and it's
Mhm.
exactly the same piece, then we take
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So it has to have some sort of attachment in that way.
Yeah.
But, you know, I can't imagine that any other institution in the country is producing so much literary work
Yeah.
as is this.
That's
You know,
right.
in my
Yeah.
class at Attica, I had a fellow, and he said he had 3 or 4 400-page novels
Mm.
that he'd written, and they all got tossed in a cell search. They went into the trash.
Oh,
Yeah.
goodness.
So there's no such thing as private property inside institutions, right? These institutions. But there are folks who are, you know, putting out the work,
Mhm.
you know, like they wouldn't believe.
We got a signal to shift, but I wanted to ask you, I have many questions, but I wanted to ask you one more question. You make the point when you're talking about Malcolm X about his having access to a good library.
Right.
And we've seen pictures of that library, which looks like Hamilton College Library or something. I mean, it's like a lovely, lovely
Mhm.
library. Can you talk about not only libraries and access to libraries as a factor in the work that folks are doing, but also the challenges from publishers and from even people on the outside who want to send books,
Mm.
just anybody. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember it used to be having taught for many, many years, you know, we'd get the reviewer copies of the books that we were teaching and
Uh-huh.
just used to just sort of forward them along to a local prison. And
Sure.
then that became hard to do. So could you
Right.
talk about that? Access to books.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I'm happy that it's gotten into the news, the book bans that have run, they become, you know, more extensive
Mhm.
in the United States. I think that happens for exactly the same reason why it was illegal under slavery to teach
Yes.
slaves to read and write, because yeah, not institutions that want, you know, knowledge, right, to be widely spread, because knowledge is power, right, as Nietzsche says.
Period.
And the access to prisons, as folks in this room can say, is spotty. It's really difficult. And it's that in part because everything in prison is difficult.
Mhm,
You know, these systems are not particularly systematic.
mhm.
You know, and people say, well, can I send this book in? I'll say, well, here are the rules. It depends on who's in the mailroom that day.
Yeah.
Because if there's a person who doesn't want it in, it's not going to go in. If there's somebody else that doesn't like the job and they're approving everything, then it's going to get in, right?
Mhm,
I mean, it's remarkable how inconsistent these places are. Someone once said, you've been inside one prison, you've been inside one prison. You
mhm,
know, it's not going to follow. It certainly doesn't carry over state lines. It doesn't
mhm,
really, carry over from institutions to facility,
mhm,
right? So it's really haphazard what that access is, and it's
mhm,
certainly not a priority by any
mhm,
means.
mhm,
I was speaking to someone who was talking about working with the Freedom Reads Project,
mhm,
and the CEOs saying, why are you doing this? These people don't read. Why are
mhm,
you putting these beautiful pieces of furniture in here? But over time, even just during that one session of going in, they started engaging with the CEOs,
mhm,
and that actually became interested, right,
mhm,
in what these folks were doing, what your project
mhm,
was doing.
mhm,
And it's really a matter of the same thing that, Primo Levi writes about, that Niels Christie, the great Norwegian criminologist, writes about. And when you make a human connection with a staff member,
mhm,
then options open up for you. But
mhm,
when that doesn't happen, and the ethos of the prison is not to do that, in fact, it's quite the
mhm,
opposite, then that doesn't happen.
mhm,
And I've actually curated a collection of essays from the archive precisely on library access.
mhm,
And that was to help out the American Library Association in pushing legislation that would open up libraries
mhm,
more for incarcerated people. So
mhm,
it's about power. It's really
mhm,
about power. Yeah.
mhm, mhm. Well, so we can keep chatting, or I think you were gonna ask me some questions,
Mhm.
or this is what's next. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
Um,
about your book. It's about you.
well, I wanted to ask you this question. With the Imagining Freedom
Yeah.
project, your history as an administrator in academic institutions. I was just wondering how sort of, your hat as a poet informs work that is obviously, clearly administrative.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I sometimes say that my adeptness at administration I'm a very practical person, actually. For much of my kids' lives, I've been a single mother. I mean, like, there's just a practicality
Mhm.
and a desire for efficiency, order, and impact that is part of who I am.
Mm.
I think that as a poet, but I was always a poet who was teaching.
Mm.
So I was in institutions and in universities that that valued, the things that I was teaching. African American studies was my field. So questions also about power used and power denied, and the questions about who's in the room, who's not in the room, who's at the table, who's not at the table. That's my whole orientation to institutions and what they can do, to resources and what they can do. As a poet, I've always said that one of the benefits of being in a field that is not particularly well remunerated, if at all, often, but has infinite human impact.
Mm.
Right? I mean, if there was some economic analysis of like how much a poem costs and how much you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so I think I've seen the miracles happen when you figure out like just how to give people a place, how to, Xerox a magazine, how to somehow get things into people's hands. And when inside universities, how to get those resources to make the walls more porous.
Mm.
And to also be more empowering, because there is so much class division within universities with what gets resourced and what doesn't. I've mostly taught at very, very, very wealthy at universities, and I've seen, the Department of African American Studies has like -3 cents in the budget. The Department of Greek or other have literally like endowments for carpets, endowments for flowers, endowments for, and more relevantly even, those are some of the, like, wow, examples, but endowments for students to travel. endowments for students to do research. The ability to do the work, the dollars are not equally distributed among
Right.
students who are paying the same amount of money to go there. That's just how I think about moving things in the world.
Mhm.
And efficiency helps with that. Because I also know, and I'm very happy a lot of my colleagues are here who have worked on Imagining Freedom with me, Alexis and Julie and Jack right over there, the amazing cluster. So we do this work together, and I'm just, as they've heard me say, I'm very, very driven by the example of my late father, who was, a race man who was always in all his work, in all his deeds, fighting to do more for more people.
Mm.
And, really pretty fearless about what he'd say and who he'd say it to. And he always counseled that you have to sort of, it's actually interesting. He would use language like, to be a thief or to be, you have to like, break in the window, he'd say, so you can go and distribute the resources. He was Robin Hoodish
Uh-huh.
in the way that he thought about everything, including knowledge. So I mean, I loved how you described the power of learning and the superpower of learning
Mhm.
and who it's for. I have always believed that, and that, the biggest thing to have and redistribute is knowledge and opportunity and light.
Mhm.
I'm gonna tell you how this happened. I'm gonna tell you how I got this job. I'm gonna tell you how we could, or how in history these people did this despite the fact that. And I think that poets, and so I write other, I mean, my poetry identity is my central one, but I'm also a scholar. I've also written fiction. I've also written play. I also have written memoir. I write in different forms.
Mhm.
But in the poetry, I do think there is so much precision and so much distillation in it, that I think you really understand the power of words in poetry when you don't have much space to make something happen. And I think that also poetry, as such an ancient cross-cultural art form, and also, I mean, there are so many incredible stories, as you know, about incarcerated people writing poetry. Wole Soyinka writing on the piece of toilet paper.
Mhm.
Poets in prison committing things to memory if there
Right.
were not, which you can do with a poem and you can't really do with a novel.
Mhm.
So which I think harkens back to, and I'm with you on the analogy to enslaved people and even further back, Frederick Douglass, let's let him be with us tonight. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy, right? And we remember that line because of how he said it, right?
Yes.
And talking about, W.E.B. Du Bois on the sorrow songs.
Mm.
You think these people are singing and happy in the fields because they're making
Right.
music and it's beautiful. But actually, these people have found a way to put the profundity of their sorrow and experience into something memorable and physical and soul that literally, has soul in it.
Right. Right.
So I do think song, poetry, that I do think that among making words, there is a very, very special power. And that, throughout all of forever, people sing the song of who they are and what they're living through. And I find that, to be very, very powerful. And then, back to precision, I think that that practice of distillation is also to an economy of action as well, and to say, like, if you don't know how long you have the floor, say exactly what you mean,
Mm.
because, you might not have the job tomorrow. You
Right.
might not have the opportunity tomorrow. You might not have the platform. You might not have the resources. And do so in a way that other people see it so that they are also empowered to sing their song and be part of making that possible for others.
So, follow-up question, very close to that. How do you see the humanities or its role in basically, uprooting, racial structures, racism, more broadly institutionalized? Like- Yeah.
Well, we talk about this, and my colleague Maria's here. We were just talking about this. We talk about this a lot because, the humanities are kind of getting a bad rap and getting caricaturized these days. And what we were talking about is like the humanities are everywhere, here's where they are, here's where they are, here's where they are. But like the humanities are everywhere. I mean, I think that very simply, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to make meaning of walking through this life? What does it mean to actually feel, through something that, critical thinking has presented to you in an illuminating kind of way, or that, the theater has dramatized for you. I mean, I really love the African-American tradition of, talking back to the screen in the movies. I know it annoys people. And it annoys me sometimes too, but I think that what I think it has roots in it's call and response.
right.
It's like, oh my, oh my God, this is how and in the way of the blues, just more and more examples of the humanities, I sing, I say I, but my I is a we. My man done left me, and y'all say, and then someone can come back with their thing. That is a superpower of being human and alive. And I just think that, the kind of interesting road to doing this work now, leading Mellon, is a lifelong, unshakable belief in that superpower, and a belief also that, everyone has a right to it. And that sometimes, when people's minds do need to open, we don't know, none of us knows everything about everybody else, that, that sometimes, that really is a way, the experiential, tell me about your life. I mean, I just have to believe, even though we see so much uh, uh, systemic meanness, individual meanness. We're living in, and not, not just like, I mean, like mean in the biggest sense of the word, so much degradation, so much unwillingness to provide people with things that human beings need to, thrive.
Right.
The simple things that we need to be able to thrive and live with dignity.
And to feel human.
And to feel human, right? I mean, and especially, in now, I mean, there have been other points, obviously, in our history when some things have been worse. But I think that for better or for worse, having grown up in an era where, though there were many steps back, we were still moving forward, and seeing all of the movements that led to more inclusion, more humanity, more of a sense of, who can do what, who deserves what, who is human, who counts, whose voices. I've seen so much change in that regard that it just seems beyond chagrin that we are in a time period where it is under so much shared humanity is under even more attack. And such violent people have such a purchase on so many people's minds. So I mean, we can't be just, all shocked, but I have had to adjust my own optimistic sense of change marching forward that has been the privilege of, my upbringing and the years of my upbringing.
Well, it's following up on that. I mean, you've written that, freedom must be seized and reasserted every day.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how, in a whole, the Imagining Freedom Project, how you see that, pushing that resolve forward.
Yeah, well, in some ways, and what I really love about all of our work is that it is quite consistent. I mean, we've done a lot of work to have a strategic umbrella canopy over everything that, and we have a really beautiful, like sweated over mission statement. Is our work contributing to, against dehumanization, for justice? I mean, it's far more beautiful than what I'm saying now, but every grant we make, all the work we do has to answer, is it doing that? And are we furthering? I mean, one of the ways that we've talked about our prison higher ed work, which is outside of Imagining Freedom, but obviously of a piece, is that, if we believe, as we do with all the funding that we do in higher ed, that, critical thinking and knowledge and diverse knowledge can set you free and empower you, well, my goodness, then certainly we must, resource it inside and not just outside. And so I think, to be able to, and the archive projects are really important to Imagining Freedom, because as you've said, and as you know, there is so much that is not recorded. And just completely walled off.
Right.
So, your archive project or Kelly Lytle Hernandez's amazing $1 Million Hoods
Yeah.
project, where, her archive is all of the LAPD records,
Right.
which tell so many stories, but only if looked through, with the historian's careful eye, just as we were speaking about with Attica, to tell the story kind of from the evidence and not from the propaganda.
Right.
And she had to sue to get access to those records. So the archival work is incredibly important. And the project Julie, the project here at NYU in the law school. Could you say a word about that, please? Thank you. Thank you.
They have a Jailhouse Lawyers initiative that's working with folks who are inside who are working Jailhouse Lawyers to make sure that their work and their experiences are visible and are connected and are archived and presented. And it's run out, and there's not a law school woman who runs the project, who we call herself as incarcerated employee after years. And they are working with folks across the country.
It's a great project. Okay, so
Fantastic.
that means we have 10 minutes? Or that means it's time to stop? Okay. Because also I was thinking about the Rikers project as well. Public Memory Project, exactly, in the archival realm too. So the archive piece is super important. And then also, and I'm really proud that in the Imagining Freedom work, as with our work at the foundation, and, being, not just being a writer, but coming from the world of words, we've done so much. I mean, the literary stuff doesn't get a whole lot of love in funding. So we're soon to announce a set of fellowships for writers, that a project that we've co-done with Haymarket,
Yeah.
and that's going to be announced really soon. And so I think that, the individuality of archives, creative expression, and also in the initiative, we have an inside out approach, which is to say, we want to hear from people who have been affected by the criminal legal system, affected by incarceration. So people inside, people formerly inside, and also this furthering the argument that, we are communities, we are neighbors, we are sisters, we are, we are, it's just a wall. It's a
Yeah.
hugely consequential wall, but I actually think that, and, a book that I've taught for many years that I really, really love is John Edgar Wideman's Brothers and Keepers.
Mhm.
And I think that what's so interesting in that book is when, he's the writer on the outside going to visit his brother Robbie, has a very, very, very long sentence. And there's a moment where Robbie says, okay, but like, I want to talk, basically, where Wideman gives the mic, gives the narrative to his brother.
Mm.
And I think that what that book illustrates and what was really important about it when it came out, 35, whatever
Right.
years ago,
Yeah.
was that understanding of crossing back and
Right.
forth.
Right.
And, there but for the grace of God, but also we are connected to one another and insist on that. And that the only way that we will understand, back to your question about dismantling, the true cost of incarceration is if we look at everyone who's affected.
Mhm.
I mean, I have found as I, in my learning, some of the statistics, about how many people in this country are directly affected
Right.
by a loved one who is incarcerated, how many kids have an incarcerated parent. So I just think that, everything we're doing is about saying, we see you, and because we focused our work in the United States, because of the time we're in, quite frankly,
Mhm.
to say like, and who are we? Who's this
Yeah.
big we?
Right.
What is
Right.
America? What is
Yeah.
it made up of? Who is it made up of? And just because you can't see someone on the street doesn't mean that we're not all a part of this we. So that's what everything we do is pushing towards, hopefully a greater understanding.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I speak to, when I organize college and prison programs, I go to community colleges and say, these are people who are part of the community,
Mhm.
right? They're here, and they make that up.
Yes.
I also wanted to ask, if you look at the history, prisons are the one institution that's come out of the United States that's gone global.
Mm.
Democracy hasn't, even free markets have not,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't find a nation that doesn't have a prison, right? Pretty much on the model that we put together, at the end of the 18th century and failing in exactly those kinds of ways. So in that context, though, the focus obviously, of the imagining freedom is the United States. What do you think the consequences or the potential is for abolitionist style work in the United States for a global transformation in thinking about incarcerating, about caging people, as a
Yeah.
way of achieving public safety?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And I think that, people, Gina Dent and Angela Davis doing such amazing
Right.
work, and Gina's visualizing abolition project, which is
Mhm.
so powerful and beautiful. I've had conversations with them about kind of what does it mean, because they do so much traveling and work. They are always thinking
Mhm.
about the global context and the global possibilities. And also, what I take from them and their learning is to remind the United States that we are being looked at,
Yeah.
in the ways that you suggest. So I think, eager to understand, I mean, focusing on what we can do here, but not limiting our imaginations. And it would be more in what we see potential grantees studying, thinking about doing, to, simply deepen our understanding of both the problem and also, the possibilities for, it's all about freedom and liberation. I
Right.
mean, at the end of the day. So that
Yeah.
can be best understood in as broad a context as possible.
Right.
Okay, so
Okay,
now I
we're
think
done.
we have done this part.
I think we've done this.
Thank
part.
you. Okay.
Thank you so much to Dr. Alexander and Dr. Larson for that amazing conversation. We are now going to do a quick swap. And so I'd now like to introduce Dean Fiello, Jason Rodriguez, and Jose Dillanoa. During Dean Fiello's tenure of incarceration at Attica, he participated in Doran Larson's writing workshop since its inception in 2007. He is deeply grateful to Doran because he taught him not only how to write, but also how to think. At 16, Jose de la Nola received 26 and 1/3 years to life sentence for second-degree murder, serving 18 years in Attica and other facilities. While incarcerated, he worked as a rehabilitation peer educator, mentoring in relapse prevention, anger management, and mental health. Jose co-founded the Attica Lifers organization, served as its president, and consulted for various organizations. Released in December 2021, he now advocates for clemency and parole reforms in New York. Jose is the clemency campaign director for the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, RAP, actively involved in initiatives such as RAP's New York State Executive Clemency Assistance and the New Yorkers for Clemency campaign. Jason Rodriguez, at 17, was sentenced to 37.5 years to life for second-degree murder, serving 19 of those years in Attica and other prisons. During his incarceration, he worked as a law library clerk, helping illiterate people in prison appeal their convictions and navigate the criminal legal system, mentored at-risk youth through a volunteer community awareness program, facilitated anger management, alternatives to violence restorative justice programs, and initiated the Equal Access to Attica's Law Library. After successfully litigating his early release in March of 2021, Jason is currently working as a research analyst with the Vera Institute of Justice, conducting qualitative research on New York's pretrial services. I will now pass it over to Jason, Jose, and Dean, who will start us off by sharing some first thoughts about Inside Knowledge.
Let me go? All right, I'll go first. I want to thank NYU for hosting this event and Elizabeth for funding the archive. It is incredibly valuable to have our voices out there and that others can hear what we have to say. And of course, Doran for his untiring work to help us to learn how to write, to come to Attica so many times. I used to get very frustrated when we knew he was coming and we planned to have a workshop, and he would arrive there and there was no gate pass. And he would drive 3.5 hours home. And then weeks later, he would come back again. I was just amazed at his dedication. So I thank him for that also. The book Inside Knowledge is powerful. And I at times had difficulty reading it because it brought back memories of Attica, but also because of when you read it and you hear what other writers in there say about prison, you can sense their pain. You know that they're in pain and suffering. And I noticed that was a commonality throughout the book, a thread that goes through it, that these men and women who, despite their pain and suffering, were insistent and dedicated to changing their lives, to becoming better people, to educating themselves. And what I most admired about the voices in the books that Doran has edited is that the paradox is that they're trying to change their lives, but they're incarcerated in places that are opposed to change. Attica is an example of a place that fights change with every breath it has. The Attica riot took place over 50 years ago. Yet to this day, the administration and the guards there are intent on seeking vengeance and retribution for what happened more than 50 years ago. And because of that anger that they hold within, they are opposed to any changes that take place in the prison, even rules that were instituted 50 years ago as a result of the riot and now serve no purpose at Attica. They continue to follow those rules. And so it's a really testament to their dedication, the writer's dedication, to bring about change in their lives when, in spite of the fact that they're surrounded by administration and guards who don't want them to change, because quite honestly, it is their security. If prisoners became better people and changed their lives and left prison, there would be no more reason to have prisons, which is what many prison abolitionists seek. So the guards want to foment the anger and the frustration and the chaos that take place in prison. And so that's been frustrating for me, and I'm sure the rest of us on this panel. So with that, I shall pass to my fellow Attica cohort,
Thank you.
Jose.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for coming out in the cold weather, and thank you for inviting us to this panel discussion. I agree with everything Dean said, and I would like to add, this is the first time that the three of us have been together in person since our release. Mind you, we all three of us lived literally on the same tier together, ate together, laughed together, argued together, talked stuff, cracked jokes on each other, like,
Argument.
you know, all type of things. I worked together, you know, was inspired by each other. So this is an amazing tradition and carry, you know, like a way to carry on, you know, our work that we've done with Doran in the class, you know, so much has happened in our 70 years of incarceration total, maybe something like that, between the three of us. Often when you leave and you don't see people anymore. You leave these places. And these are people that literally spent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 300, more than some of people in this room or listening spend with their own family. And so we leave, and the story of our time together ends, and we don't see each other, and you wonder, and you appreciate those times that you had with them. Because in many ways, if it wasn't for these two and several others, I might not be around today. You know, there's been plenty of times where they kept me out of trouble or just distracted. And so here we are talking about that experience, and I think there's so much said about the incarcerated life. And it was so graciously said, who's not at the table? And so I think Doran Larson's work is bringing people to the table from the very beginning, because if you are involved in any type of criminal justice work and you don't have a directly impacted, formerly incarcerated person with you, then your work is not going to work. It's not. It's missing its soul. It's a car with no gas. It's a hope, you know, but no, you know, there's no fire in that thing that's going to get it going. And so that's what Doran brings, is he brings these voices together in this book and much of his work because it's needed. And you can't argue with thousands of essays from across the country, people that have never met, prisons that don't even know about other prisons, and they all say consistently the same thing. In a court of law, that's more than enough evidence, we know, especially in this country, to get somebody convicted. We also know that's data for archive. We know that's historical information. And so it's an amazing opportunity for people to really peel back the layers of our prison system and look at, you know, the evidence that it's doing exactly what it's meant to be doing. And it's harming all of us from what it's meant to be doing. It's not designed to be successful. And so I'll leave you with this little thought. Any opportunity or any, you know, situation where you hear something about incarceration, you see a show, a crime drama or something like that, always ask yourself this question, like, what is it trying to say about our prison system? And then who is not able to be represented? And, you know, if it says that our system is like doing what it's, you know, like it's the popular thing and it's like advertising all the terrible things, then don't waste your time on it. But if it's also not incorporating the actual voices of people that is directly impacted, then you have to ask yourself, like, what is their purpose? And maybe they have a genuine desire to see change, but the question is, like, when are you going to bring the people in that have the experience, that can tell you exactly what's going on? Because there's nobody in this room that can tell me what it's like to be in prison, especially for 26 years. So if you want to know what could be done, I'm sure you have some great ideas. I'm sure you have an amazing connections, and I'm sure things that I never thought of, but you might not know, it may not work. I don't know. So I'll leave you with that. bring more people to the table. Inside Knowledge does a great, great work at that, and thank you.
Yeah, I kind of share the same sentiments with Dean and Jose, and this is a great experience just to be outside of that cage with two of my dear friends. One of the most important things is sitting here and looking at the audience here today. And it's like you all, I want to thank you. You're witnesses to our voice, a voice that I never thought would be heard outside of those walls. A voice that I thought I would die in prison without anyone kind of hearing what the struggles that we had when Dora go through at that time in our lives. And kind of what Inside Knowledge does and what Doran has done for all of us is kind of help bring that voice to the table. As a youth, I was never able to really communicate the pain and hurt that I experienced in my childhood or my life. I never knew how to express that. I kind of kept it inside until one day it kind of imploded and then exploded outwardly. And then I ended up in prison at the age of 17 years old. And through my incarceration, seeing the atrocities that were committed on my fellow incarcerated folks and people by those in authority was just astoundingly horrible and cruel. And it was really rough. And when I entered Doran's class, kind of just having the ability to get some words out on paper, it started out with me just kind of writing an essay and then doing this introspection of my life and how I became incarcerated to begin with. And that kind of saved me from like wanting to commit suicide because the guards were just so brutal. It wasn't even at the hands of fellow prisoners. It was at authority figures that were just blatantly racist and cruel and horrible and did everything to oppose your reformation and rehabilitation that doesn't exist behind that wall. So I'm like incredibly thankful to be a part of this group and to have our voices out there. And what Inside Knowledge does is that brings that to the forefront for all of you to witness and now say, hey, this has to stop in our name. You know, because at the end of the day, taxpayers kind of fund what happens behind those walls. And those walls now need to be transparent. And what happens behind that wall needs to be held accountable for those actions. And those voices in Inside Knowledge and our voices up here today kind of bring that to the forefront for all of you folks to kind of see. I often hear, like, what can we do to kind of further the cause and help just by you sitting here today and listening to all of us and just hearing or reading Inside Knowledge and taking the next steps to kind of ask that same question. You've already done a major part in this equation. And one of the last things I want to say kind of on the book is I've litigated law inside on people's atrocities through the courts, through civil and criminal. And I've seen denial. And basis on that denial was that we're not allowed to tell you what goes on behind this wall. We do not have the credibility to tell you what's behind that wall. But as what Jose said, like in prisons throughout the nation, we never met each other. And collectively, we formed that credibility. And if anyone was to look and compare and to say that and to look at that, you would know that we're not lying and that our voices are valid and that what we're saying is true, and not because that we were convicted that we don't get to speak anymore. Just because I got convicted doesn't mean I lost my credibility, doesn't mean I'm no longer human. Some things in law, we've only constituted 3/5 of a person. That's not fair. That's not right. So Inside Knowledge kind of sheds that light. And I just want to again, thank you for being witness to our voices.
Oh, very good, thank you. I like that.
Back in class.
Yeah.
How many times do I have to revise this? again?
Yeah.
It's like the 30th time.
Yeah.
I want to say, first of all, I appreciate, the thanks you've given me.
Sure.
Oh, microphone.
Thank you.
Sure. Uh, I appreciate the thanks that you've given me. I feel as though, I may have helped you along the way. But you guys, as I mentioned before, are the reason that class kept going. And my work in prisons completely transformed my life. I am a happier, more engaged, more full person than I was before that. And it's largely because of working with you and counting you as my friends. And it puts, for volunteers who come in from the outside and work inside prisons, I never felt my life, the problems, whatever problems I had, were so small as when I walked out the gate and went back out into the parking lot. It's like all these things I'm going crazy over, they're really not big deals. They're not like, what you're dealing with inside. So you get that perspective, and also, it gave me a really sense of vocation in life. And I want to thank you for that. I wanted then to just ask you a few questions for everybody. And just really basic question, aside from the workshop, I don't want this to be praise again for the workshop. We've done that. But what did it mean to you to engage in the process of writing while you were inside?
I go first again?
Go ahead, Dee.
I get to go first. It taught me who I was. I didn't know when I was in prison, who I was, what was important to me, or even how to really formulate thoughts. I was just existing. And because I didn't know what was important to me, led to me doing very stupid things and sent me to prison. But your workshop, when you gave us the motivation to create something, to form our opinions, to tell you and to tell others what we feel, what was important to us, what we believed. That changed my life. It was the first time that I really looked at who I was and began to formulate what was important to me. So thank you for that.
Yeah, programs inside prisons are a commodity. Not the docs run programs, the state run programs, because those are talking about that, but anything that's volunteer run, anything that's run by incarcerated people, everybody wants to be a part of it. And whether they stay or not, depends on like if they've find what they're looking for. And so sometimes when they come to the writing class, maybe they're not ready, because it does challenge you to peel back your layers. And if you don't, I don't know, you don't write your truth in your story. And there's some like inner conviction, I feel like, that goes on with that. But being part of that workshop, travel, like you get known for being in there. And so what happens is, like, people will be like, oh, I heard you're in that workshop. If I give you something, could you help me write it? Could you help me edit it? Like, and I'm like, all right, I'll help you. But I was like, listen, I'm not rewriting the thing for you. I'll just give you some ideas, some thoughts. And I'm basically telling them everything I got from the class and stuff that I just like randomly fell over from like thinking deeper about what we learned in class. So I think what I got out of it was just passing that message on, and helping other people. And I think that's what we do as caring, loving people. When we have something that we know can benefit, we share it. And that's very hard in prison. It's very hard to share things in those places, especially when they're personal, because they often become weaponized against you. The staff will find your essay, they'll find something, and they'll use that information against you. They'll try to embarrass you with it. They'll try to further, degrade you with it. They'll try to prosecute you with the information that's in there, slander your character. Anything that can be used against you can be weaponized by staff. And so often it was just like those letters are like, it's a 3-page story about this person's life that's folded down so small that, you could like hide it behind your thumb and your palm, and then you just pass it. I mentioned that because like that's how we learn inside. And so it was great to have that class to go and not have to worry about you know, all those other things. And so then you just be like, I have to pass this on. I have to give this to other people. And so, you know, there were times I was asked, and whether I had the time or not, I did the best I could. And I'm hoping that I had the same kind of impact that I got.
Well, I definitely can say like I feel like the impact was just mutually felt. I've told you many times of how I felt like writing saved my life, especially inside prison. I entered prison with like a 7th grade education, and then I ended up leaving with a bachelor's degree. During that time when I came into Doran's class, I had not really came to like grips with what I had done. I didn't understand it. I was a child myself and entering the system and trying to hold myself accountable, being held accountable, but at the same time, just trying to understand my place. And I remember that I just wanted to give up. I remember tying like a bed sheet and wetting it and then like wrapping that around the gate so like the officers couldn't come in to the cell to get me in time, because I've seen that many times play out where people have done it and survived. And I was not going that route. And I remember like just taking that down and like, no, I got to keep going, like trying to be that motivated, like factor just to stay alive. And then I entered Doran's class, and I remember it was the first time I had come across like the book, like the Best American Essays. And I had taken that back. We had like workshops, I guess some essays we were supposed to read and then kind of give our thoughts on it. And it was this learning circle of ideas where people were exchanging these thoughts and processes. And we were all exchanging ideas and learning from each other. And it was like so exciting and invigorating. And I went back to the cell and I opened the book and I was just like, wow, this is truly amazing. But I still feel like I don't know how I'm going to go on in this environment that's so cruel and against anything like transformative or positive. And then I remember opening it up to, I think, one person, which I'm probably going to forget the last name, but it was a person by the name of Randolph, I remember. And it was called Handicapped. And it was a person writing about their experience inside of a wheelchair and how that person didn't want to be like helped along. He wanted to have as best as he can go through life on his own and just be without having to be like, oh, I feel sorry for you. Let me get this for you, that for you. Let me live life the way I want to live life. And I remember just reading that essay and saying, like, how can I give up? Like, how can I quit when this person who's handicapped, who has probably what I see as less than I did? Like, I had all my limbs to walk from A to B, where this person had to be in a wheelchair. And I just remember seeing that, and that was like, wow, like I have to keep going. And I want to be in this class and learn and kind of just keep going through the process. And it was just a place of that I can come and get greeted. I got greeted by my first name. How you doing today, Jason? Doran Shuck, he made it a habit of himself to reach out every time we walk through that door to shake our hand and smile on our face and ask us how our day was. And that just was so transformative for me.
I have to tell an anecdote when I was first going in. You know, like other classes, I wanted people to read. So I would take 2 big canvas bags of books when I would go in. And I'd put the books out on a table and guys could take whatever book they wanted. And I would leave, and it turns out the shift changed between when I went in and went out. So the COs would see me coming in with these bags of books, and the ones going out would see these empty book bags, right? They never made the connection between the two. I was hauling, you know, I think I counted probably over 1,500 books I probably took inside, you know, and got distributed in one way or another.
500 of them.
And then one CO said, what are you teaching, a speed reading class in there, you know, with all these books? He says, I'm going to wait here. I'm going to write down all the names of these books, and you better have those when you come out. So I go in and I say, I'm sorry, you can't take the books tonight. I got to bring it back out. And I couldn't after that, you know, they're on to Dean. Got upset. He wrote to the deputy superintendent program and said, I'm so upset that Professor Larson can't bring these books in anymore. So he totally outed me. No. The DEP called me in and said, you do know that carrying these books inside is a felony because we haven't had to, you know, we haven't been able to check them. And she didn't arrest me, which she could have done, you know, on the spot. But that was sort of the end of doing that. And I heard you said that many of those books ended up in solitary.
Yeah, they've got passed around the prison. Some wound up in the library,
Okay.
and some went into the, they had a cart that they would bring down from the library to the solitary confinement cells.
Oh, okay.
And those books would amazingly make their way back to the library.
Well, that's great.
They would also travel to other prisons too, because I saw one of the books on the bookshelf in the Cayuga dorm library. Yeah, so they travel across the state.
Yeah.
Um,
That's great. But it's also a demonstration of how completely haphazard these places are. That's how books got in, out of my complete naivete, and just, walking in and haphazardly dropping them there. One thing I wanted to ask you is, my experience is inside Attica, and I've worked in Mohawk and Mid-State, with college programs. But in your time, people think you go to prison, and it's just prison until you get out. But you've all been to different prisons across the state, right? And transferred. So what's that experience like when you have to pick up and just move to another institution?
It's dehumanizing, because I literally had to put everything I owned into a garbage bag. And you can't help but reflect upon your own life when everything you own, fits in a couple of plastic garbage bags, and this is it. This is your life. And then, of course, get thrown into the belly of a bus and tossed around, and it's a difficult, painful process of being uprooted and moved around. Didn't like it at all.
Yeah.
I think I counted at one time I had been in 19 different cells.
Wow.
And it gets confusing. It really gets confusing as to sometimes I forgot what my cell number was, and because you're moved around so much.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, we hate transfers, because people don't like change. So you just get used to the terrible place you're in, and you're just like, all right, at least the guards know me, I know people, I have my pattern, I have my programs, and then you're uprooted because you don't have a say in when you can leave or when you can transfer. You do have 2 transfer request opportunities, but you don't know where you're going. You don't have a clue. You're just one day at 5 o'clock in the morning told, hey, pack your stuff, you're leaving. And you're not told where you're going. And then, you leave and you're shackled and handcuffed for easily 10 to 14 hours with no break in between, on a bus, sometimes shackled with another person, who's equally, if not even more unhappy that they're being transferred. I'll bring up one of my transfers really quick, was a security transfer actually, I was forcibly removed from the Attica prison, because I fell in love, literally fell in love, with my partner over there. And, the administration, is if they're against education, and if they're against forming relationships, meaningful humanizing relationships, they are most certainly against any sort of affection happening between anybody, even though it happens way more than they'd like to admit about. So they just took me out of Attica after some attempts at, interrogation, and then and I left. But I left without anything, any of my property that I had, my photos, my letters, things that I valued, of what little bit I could fit into, that could be fit into 4 little bags. And luckily that, it eventually did catch up with me, but I think what it taught me was, like, prison is really good at teaching you that you have no autonomy and no control. And it is daily reinforced. Daily reinforced. And I think the only type of control you really have is only over your physiological functions. Other than that, everything is controlled. When and where and how you do anything, literally any of that, and where you live. So, it's terrible. Imagine anybody just coming along and saying, we're gonna move you from your place to another, and you don't know what that place is gonna be. So it's not great.
And you have 2 hours
Mm.
to get your stuff together.
If that, yeah.
Yeah, I share the same sentiments as Dean and Jose. It's definitely dehumanizing and something you don't want to do. I still have a problem with kind of like transitioning. I don't want to move, because constantly moving from cell to cell or prison to prison. I mean, like, the stuff that they'll make you do, you'll be moved like 4 or 5 times in 1 week. And like under even the Geneva Convention, like, this can constitute torture. You're put in stress positions where you're shackled from feet to hands. There is a way to transport people. You can still transport them securely, but this isn't inhumane and they do it on purpose. And you literally, if you're shackled here, you have to eat like this. And it's very difficult to even do that. And on top of that, you're chained to another individual. I happen to be chained on one instance was I was chained to a mentally disturbed person who kept hearing voices and was talking to himself and biting himself. And the guard, instead of kind of addressing that and kind of getting that person some help at one of the transfer overs, he resorted to try to beat that person, to subdue him. So, yeah, you never know what you're gonna walk into or get, but it's definitely like uprooted, and then you can lose your property. And 9 times out of 10, you lose your property. So imagine having your wallet, your car keys, your phone, things that are of value to you. Just, I'm gonna lose it today because I don't like that everyone on the bus is talking today. And I'm gonna punish each and every one of you for that one person's act. And the next time you get to the next facility, it's not just a transfer over to a new facility, a new environment where you have to now try to adapt and see how you're gonna learn or survive in that environment, but now you're gonna do so without the property that you have. And many of us, I myself, had lost legal work that was detrimental to me fighting my case and kind of communicating with my attorney at the time. So yeah, it's very dehumanizing.
A very different key. All of you have gone through college programs inside prisons. And I was wondering what that experience was and what that meant to you to actually be getting formal education while you were inside.
You go first.
I go first? All right. That was amazing and too much work. Everybody who's still in college, do you feel my pain? Oh my. So, in total, I was enrolled in college for 10 years. Because, you know, the classes were so few, they were just starting. So I had a long time to be, which was actually really good because it really helped to make that time go by in a very productive and you know, creative way. I think what I got most out of the college experience is just being able to really like evaluate things in a very I don't know, just a very practical way that I always struggled with when I was younger. And it was a great experience to also just sit with people in an environment that I thought was never going to be a reality for me. You know, 26 years, I had a sentence of 26 to life. So technically I did not have to be released on parole. I could quite literally still be inside right now until I die. And that was a reality. So college was never something that, you know, I thought would happen. And then it did with the, you know, great work of Doran. In 2011, college came back to Attica. When I first was there, they had college programs, but the Tappan Pell had been disbanded for incarcerated people. And so it went away. But I think probably my most memorable part of the college program is just one professor wrote a piece about his college experience, and he said the safest he ever felt in the prison was in the one place where they told him that he would never be safe, and that was in the classroom. And you know, I have coffee with him occasionally now that I'm out, and it's great. And he's like, there's no other place I would rather be a professor at than in a prison. He's like, I would rather be a professor in prison than in any institution. He's because it meets all of his needs of why he does the work. You know, people want to learn, they're engaging, they disagree with him, they agree with him, they challenge him, but at the end of the day, we're all learning and like improving our lives on what we learn. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel those same sentiments. Having access to education behind prison walls was so satisfying. Just to engage, I was first off, like I would be in my cell, just talking to myself, trying to engage for any intellectual stimulation whatsoever. I used to write before I entered prison, Pell Grants were already gone. So what I was doing is like, I try to learn how to read first. So I got a dictionary, I started studying words individually and then memorizing the definition of that. And then I seen that they had a GED course, I took that. But beyond that, there was no college programs for me. And so what I resorted to do was reach out to colleges and say, hey, can I just get your curriculum? I would just really like to study that. and kind of better myself. And so these colleges would send me their curriculum and then I would just study that. And then finally, Genesee Community College had a program. I didn't get into that one in the beginning, but I got into a correspondence course, which just opened my eyes to just learning. As a kid, I don't know any of you in here, I hated going to school. I used to cut every class, didn't like it. And then when I got to prison and I started to learn how to read and write, and then I got into college and then just sociology, psychology 101, it just opened my mind to so many different things. And I was so grateful. And I was like, we need more of this. It was just an amazing experience. And it's why I'm able to speak the way I can today and kind of just go forward and be successful.
What I learned was that I enjoyed learning. I didn't realize that until I participated in, in the college program. My idea of reading and writing was email until I went to prison. And once I got to your class and started to, and you would bring in your bags of books, which I loved. And so I devoured them. I loved it. I was fascinated by the prose, by the talent of the writers, by the ideas, I loved, at the end of the day to sit down with a book and read. And I had never done that at any point in my life until I went to prison. And so, fortunately, that habit has stayed with me. And I'm deeply grateful for you opening my eyes as to literature and how valuable it is.
Thank you. Elizabeth, do you want to come back up?
Thank you all so much for everything you shared with us. We'll now start a Q&A session. If you have a question, feel free to line up behind one of these two mics. And yeah, feel free to ask any of our speakers.
I'm in charge of the Zoom questions as well. So we have some that have been written in by our virtual attendees. I think these are kind of directed at Doran, but I would be interested to hear everyone's responses. So the first question we received was, thank you for your most wonderful work and most recent book, as well as Fourth City. In your teaching, have you come across Black or Indigenous teachers of writing? And if so, are there any qualitative differences in the teaching outcomes across different teachers of different backgrounds?
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? There's part of it I think I missed.
Sure. This person is asking if in your career as a teacher, you have come across Black or Indigenous teachers of writing, other writing teachers, other writers you might be teaching in the classroom, and what differences you've seen from teaching from people from different backgrounds, I think is what the question is getting at.
Yeah, a tough question. I don't know of other teachers who are, mostly I get involved. Yeah, the odd thing about teaching in prison is you often don't know who else is teaching there because you have one class, one night, right? You go in at one time, you don't necessarily meet the other people that you're teaching with, which I think is, problematic unless we make, some sort of informal, social occasion outside. But in terms of the students who are inside, I found, well, this may be peculiar to the classes that I've taught. The most remarkable thing I found about what happens with the incredibly diverse population that you have inside college classrooms is that often what I find is that the camaraderie that people feel as students can be stronger than their identification with their racial group. Because the racial group may be common in the institution, but being college students is not. So I've heard some of the most open, honest conversations about race inside an institution which is highly racialized because students identify themselves as students. And we all, I make very clear whatever goes on in here, this is, and I put it in the rubric of teaching how to be students, right? College classrooms, it stays in here, right? You don't take the beef out on somebody else because you disagree about it, in a reading of the Scarlet Letter, right? It tends not to go that way anyway, but I did have, one class I was teaching Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And the first statement this white guy said is he said, "I don't believe she could have written this book," which is exactly what they said in, 1861 when it came out, right? Because of who she was. And so that led to, a really intense conversation. But the people who were sort of most at odds at the beginning of that, I watched them, we were waiting for the bell to go off to leave. And they were in a really, really, interesting, engaged conversations. They shook hands, and then we all left the room, right? So if that answers the question in some way, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And if I could
Yeah.
add, I have not taught in prison, but taught Harriet Jacobs and many other, books for many, many years, and teaching mostly African-American literature to very, very mixed groups of people. I too believe, I mean, I would say in the 13 weeks of the semester, like we are a community, and the things we've got right in the middle of the room, I'd have my tote bags too. This is what's important. This is what we're all doing. This is what we're all trying to figure out. And because the subject matter, I mean, I sometimes will say now, people can talk about race and difference. It can be done. Life isn't easy all the time. Conversations aren't easy all the time. Imagining in such a classroom, I feel I've probably heard that too. I don't believe she wrote it. And then, someone else says, well, why don't you believe that? But it is a community for that time that folks are together. I do think that also in the question, something that's interesting and what, I think a lot of students are attuned to is the disparity of who teaches and of, who is in all kinds of professional positions, right? So, I mean, obviously there are great teachers of all races, and people can teach, if you will, across race. But the issue of what does it mean to be taught for the first time by someone who looks like me, I think is also an interesting and real one too. So just lots of different ways that people learn about who gets to be at what table. Yeah.
I was wondering, you guys, what is your thoughts about that in terms of
Um,
like? what
Can I
happens
follow up
to
on what
white
Elizabeth
college?
said? Because when you mentioned tables, it reminded me that at Attica was very racialized, and the yards, there was a white table, black table, Latino table, and you weren't allowed to even visit any other tables.
Mhm.
But once we entered the classroom, all that was left out in the yard.
Mhm.
None of that was brought in to the classroom. And we just treated each other with respect, regardless of our skin color or our background or our education or our beliefs. And we were all equals in the classroom. And that's one of the things I really valued so much about college education.
Mhm. And that's about your teaching too. I mean.
Well, ironically, I never taught in the college program that was there.
Oh,
I
interesting.
organized it, and I
Uh-huh.
taught in the program that I organized in Central New York.
Mm-hmm.
But I continued the non-credit course
I see.
while I was doing that, but it just
Okay.
wasn't viable for me to go back and forth, at the
Mhm,
time.
mhm. I would still like to compliment you.
Oh, well.
All right, so the second question we have from the online Q&A is how would you describe the value to society and the contribution to our nation, not only of the writing produced by people in prison, but also their visual arts, their music, their other creative expressions? And is there an effort to bring together such creations for public awareness and benefit in a coherent way? So I guess what other artistic creative projects are you guys aware of, and what, other programs did you guys work with and experience while you were incarcerated?
Well, there are a couple of organizations that focus specifically on visual arts. Justice Arts Coalition is a really, really wonderful one led by Wendy Jason. And that's not the field, that I work on. But actually recently we had a convening online of all kinds of folks who work with the creative products of incarcerated people, because it's such a patchwork of all the rules and regulations. They're slow down trying to get this work out because, again, they're institutions that want to keep it inside, right? They don't want it to go anywhere else. And we're trying to create basically kind of consortium, and it would be a platform for us to, exchange ideas, like this worked here, this didn't work there, changes in policies, directives that come out of the institutions. And now, as you mentioned, I mean, this is a very different era. When I started doing this work, went into prison the first time in 2006. There's much more awareness that this is a problem institution, and that work really needs to come out, right, in various ways. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think this work can be absolutely transformative for the country. If this work were widely disseminated, if people were reading and understanding what exactly goes on inside these institutions, which are really sort of the anchor, both for inequality in the United States and for ideas about rule of law, right, equity and justice, and all these sort of noble ideas that we tout and pass around. The overlap between the damage that they do, right, and the claims for what they actually achieve would transform, people's ideas about who knows how many different debates, right, that go on at a really, really stupid level, when it comes to, politicians. And the higher level the politician, the dumber the conversation gets. No, no.
Also, I would say in the visual arts, before my work at Mellon, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to co-create the Art for Justice Fund, which, especially in the visual arts, because it was the invention, the imagination, the generosity of Agnes Gund, who is, a huge visual arts patron. That work has supported and gathered a lot of extraordinary visual work that, I mean, I think of, and in Mellon too, and Imagining Freedom, much of which we are supporting. So I think about Nicole Fleetwood, scholar, curator, who's put together an amazing both book and show that might even still be at the Schomburg. It left already, called Marking Time, beautiful visual art made by incarcerated people. The artist Jesse Crimes, who, started making his well, actually, I think he made work before he went in, but then really developed his artwork when he was inside, and now is institution building and, making more opportunities and fellowship opportunities available to more visual artists, has really dedicated himself to that. And his work, I wish we could show things now, but one of his work is exquisite, and he has worked remarkably with the few materials that he could have, doing portraits on soap bars, and doing transferring images, and portraits are a big part of what he does, onto bed sheets, and then sort of glazing them so they look like, I don't know, almost nothing you've ever seen. You look at them and you think like, this is a translucent human soul that I'm seeing on this. And then the next wave is, that's what it's the bar of, that's what he had. He didn't have a canvas. He was ingenious as well as brilliant in making this beautiful art. So, I want to just call out that whole arena of the visual arts where there's a lot of great stuff going on.
Thank you. Final question from here. You all are welcome to ask more. Prison writing is likely censored, definitely censored, impeding the ability of the writer to convey their full truth. Still, the value of their accounts is immense, but are you engaged in interviewing people after their return to the community to perhaps get a more complete account, much like the WPA interviews with ex-slaves after emancipation?
We've not done that yet, but we are going to be offering fellowships to formerly incarcerated people, calling the APWA fellows. And we don't want to put a lot of expectations for people, because people have got their hands full just, readjusting to life outside. But those folks will essentially, serve as consultants for us. We have an advisory board, members of which, their total incarceration years, come to almost 100 years, across, 4 folks. So that's sort of one of our next steps. We've had our hands very full just taking in the work that comes in. And then we've also developed what we're calling a writer's cohort. And those are a group of people with whom we have really regular and reliable communication, which is not easy with people inside, as a sort of go-to group when we are looking to have work reprinted in other journals and magazines to disseminate the work farther.
And you know, just when we think about the scale of what you've already done and the almost unimaginable scale of what would it mean and how amazing it would be to be able to interview, you know, everyone, every returning person. I think that that actually helps me fathom the scale of the problem. You know, that many lives, that many stories, how could we possibly interview everyone? But I think to aspire to, you know, as much breadth as possible is so, so important.
Right, right. Just to give you, you know, one sort of image of the amount of work that we have now. At 5 million words, we're close to half of all known North American slave narratives. So that means within a predictable period of time, there will be more first-person testimony to mass incarceration than we have a first-person testimony to enslavement. And then we'll keep growing, you know, from that point forward. So there's just, you know, enormous potential body. Yeah.
Wow.
So questions from them?
Can people hear on the Zoom? If you, I think we have to come to, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Dean, Jose, Jason, did I get that right? Thank you. Thank you both for being here also. I just love to know what you three love to write about, what you enjoy writing about. That's it.
Are you talking about now?
Yeah, whatever.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I'll be quick to give the fellows time. I don't have the time to write. Well, I'm not making the time to write. I'm not gonna make an excuse. I'm not making the time to write the things that I'm very interested about, some of which is about my transition from coming, you know, incarceration. And that's just because like, I mean, I'm 2 years out and I'm still trying to figure it all out with a full-time job that is like an enormous amount of responsibility. And so I find that most of my writing now is driven towards my work, which is sometimes like didactic, it's educational, sometimes it's like counter argument stuff, sometimes it's just like an email to a family member who's like desperate to hold on to hope for their loved one that's like dying in prison and hoping for the only thing that could happen is clemency. So those are meaningful things to write. So I'm finding some of that creative meaningfulness outlet there, but I don't know. I just wrote. I never intended to write anything I wrote. They just were like stories that came out, and I just like, they just had to be written. And so like, in some ways, like I'm compulsive about it because like, as soon as it comes, like everything stops, and I have to go and do it until it gets to a place where like, okay, I can leave it alone, because I know like my college work is not going to get done or like whatever. But. So, and then in short, the answer is like the story that needs to be told. So I hope that was clear.
One thing I became fascinated with was Buddhist literature. Essays written by Buddhist monks and nuns. And so I gravitated towards the concept of impermanence, which really fascinated me. And so I wrote about it. In fact, one of my essays is called Impermanence, which is on the archive. I wrote a couple of pieces where I started out by saying, I don't like change. And then as I got out, of course, of prison and my life went through dramatic changes, then my view of change also changed. And so I now love the fact of impermanence as part of the universe. So, you know, my views have changed and evolved, and so that has become a focus of my writing.
Yeah, for myself, it was just like what Jose said, kind of the story I needed to write at the time. And that's I think we revised that during close to like 15 times, like my personal narrative of how I ended up in prison and kind of did that introspection and understanding the ununderstandable, I guess, to say for the least. But after that piece and that process, that kind of like allowed me to close the chapter on that part of my life and move on. And then I had wrote this piece that Doran hasn't seen yet, but it was called Sparrow. And it was about these little birds, the sparrow, that used to come inside the prison. And I noticed that like no other life form would like come inside the prison besides ourselves. But these little birds used to come to the window and chirp so much in the morning time. And all my neighbors used to be like so mad and upset because they lost their sleep. And they used to like shoot rubber bands at them and like scream at them. And here I was like getting little like soup things and trying to lure them to my cell just so I can have some company. And I kind of saw like one bird that had like a broken wing. And I watched this bird and I brought it water. And I was just kind of attending to this bird and it was just healing me. And then from that, I was envisioning, I seen like the mother come back and like grab this bird and like nurture it. And then I've watched that bird like fly off. And then I envisioned myself kind of like, that's going to be me one day, right? Even though my situation was so hopeless, I kind of kept in my mind, like I guess the challenge of like intellectual, like, I guess contradiction, where it's like, I know the situation is hopeless, but yet I still want to make it otherwise. And as I watched this bird with like what I thought was a broken wing, like heal and then fly away, I wasn't too far off from that. And that just really just brightened up my day.
Yes.
you're okay
For
if I
the-
say it. Should I
Oh,
just-
you mind? Yeah, thank you. It's so the people can hear on the Zoom.
So first thing first, I want to say I appreciate everybody who's up here and who's leveraged their expertise and experience to enlighten us all. I want to say I'm also a student of Professor Larson's, though I wasn't incarcerated. I was a student at Hamilton. So I'm also incredibly appreciative of his tutelage over the years. I wanted to ask you, men, if your identities as writers, thinkers, readers on the inside were perceived as or experienced as a safeguard or a liability inside. Like, did folks, COs in particular, view you negatively for cultivating a writing or thinking or reading identity? And did your incarcerated folks, peers, view that or treat you differently because you were writers, thinkers who could potentially leverage your experience in a law library to help them navigate their legal cases? So,
Can I answer
Thank
that
you.
one first? It was not a liability. It was an asset for me because I got a lot of requests to edit pieces for other writers. And it also became a form of protection for me because I'm not a good fighter. As my panelists know, my fight record in prison is 0-3. But you know, by doing someone a favor, by editing their pieces, they would watch out for me and help me out, and you know, became they appreciated, you know, the help that I gave them. So
Yeah, I'll answer one part and try not to cover too much of it. For the guards, for the most part, I think for most of the guards, the response was like, they felt like, first they thought it was like taxpayer money. So if you were attending a program, they thought their tax money was going for it. And, you know, it would never was. But for most of them, it's just, for them, it's like, what are you wasting your time for? You're gonna, like, what are you gonna do with it? And, you know, like, you're not gonna be published, whatever. They don't really think critically about it, but there's the small few staff who probably take a little bit more time to think about things. And like, they draw a very interesting tie together. Like, you go to college, you're in the law library, you're in the lifers program, you write, you're a facilitator, you're probably an organizer. That means you're dangerous. That means you know a lot of people in prison. That means you're respected for in many ways, in some ways, maybe not. And then, so now they want to now it's like you become scrutinized and you become looked at and you become investigated, and like, you know, they'll come in and they'll start, instead of just like lazily coming in to search the cell and just flipping things around, all of a sudden they're sitting on your bunk and like reading your stuff, and they don't want to read anything, you know, unless it's a magazine, and then like they're reading it because they want to know, are you a danger to them? So there is that phenomenon.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced kind of both ends of that equation. And it's kind of where my peers, like, they'll see me trying to better myself and it's like, oh, what you getting an education for? What you partaking in this for? You're only gonna come back in like 5 years, kind of projecting some of the stuff that many of, us inside had insecurity about. But then that quickly like transformed to see like they witnessed like the positive transformation of myself and like the way I was speaking or acting differently or just trying to involve myself with more volunteer programs. And that kind of got them in curious to be like, hey, like, what's this program about and how can I attend? So I witnessed that aspect too. And then on the other side of that, I was what they commonly refer to as a jailhouse lawyer. So like I was known within the prison law library that I worked there and I can kind of help litigate your case. And so kind of that played a major role where it was like, oh, that's Jason, like he can help me. And so that like countered respect within the prison system. And then I was just the person to go to for knowledge and assistance and help and a person that would help you. So even if someone would talk negatively about me for trying to better myself, it would be counted by the individual that I might have helped the other day. So it was kind of in that essence, if that answers your question. And I thank you for it. It's a great question. Thank you.
If there's one more question, we have time for that. Please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As you all were talking earlier, I was thinking a little bit about the participation of incarcerated folks in like the broader apparatus or endeavor of like literature or art more generally in culture. And I'm a writer too, and I was thinking about how there's a fair amount of gatekeeping, as you said, Doran, about how like it will get relegated to being just prison writing, even though it might be like a really fantastic work of literature. And I was thinking about how a lot of the best literary magazines now won't even take paper submissions, which is itself like a sort of gatekeeping mechanism, like at its very core. So I'm kind of curious what advice you all would give to the cultural institutions to help break down some of those barriers. I would say maybe you should take paper submissions, but what else might you suggest?
We're working now to, part of what we're doing with the Mellon grant is to disseminate more work. So it's not just like accumulate, but to get the work out. So we have guest editors who are putting books together, Elizabeth Hinton at Yale, and did you have an answer?
Oh, no, dude,
No,
hold the
your
microphone.
microphone.
Oh, okay. Can you hear now? Got it. Okay, sorry. Don't usually walk around with a mic in my hand. Not accustomed to this. And I think if we can get those books out, and really, get some profile recognition of them, then a journal that's going to say, we're only going to take electronic work. We can't get anything from these folks. We're cutting ourselves out of something, right? So, I mean, that's the way we're, working with that. When I was teaching the class at Attica, it was still, you could stand in paper. So we didn't run into that problem with that then, yeah. So.
And I guess what I would add is that, at the end of the day, I think the goal is for more human beings to touch other human beings, right? And there's a lot of different ways that happens. And there's also a lot of different kinds of reading that we all do. There's some reading that you do and it's best done in a classroom to take time to go through it. What's in this? What does it mean? It's taking it apart. And there's some reading that I think about a program I love, the Poems on the Subway. Take it in. Maybe it's your stop. Maybe that's the only time you have with it, but a flash has come into you. Another human soul has come into you. Maybe you think about it again. Maybe you return to it. So I think that recognizing that there are many, many, many different ways and kinds of writing with which we can reach each other. And so I think that means that all kinds of, the publishing industry is not only very hard to break through. And by the way, I actually don't think that per se is a problem because there is there's money and resource and time and, selection. People say gatekeepers. and there are gatekeepers, but there are also thoughtful selectors, who are trying to say like, wow, this is a shiny penny. How can we bring this? How can we share it? How can we put the resources, given that we can bring out, 6 a year, right? How are we going to make that choice? But I think that a larger issue is how do, and I haven't yet seen, but I've read the book that American Fiction is based on. The movie that's out right now, starring Jeffrey Wright, based on a book by called Erasure by Percival Everett. And what that's about is an African-American man who, when he tries to tell the story of his real life, which contains no stereotypes in it, that he can't sell his work. And then when he makes up, a whole stereotypical thing, it's like, oh, an authentic, like, now we're going to publish this. And the hoax gets away, from him, and, he wins a Pulitzer Prize, like the whole thing. I can't wait to see it. But I think that it's very important what that story lays bare, which is about, do we see each other with stereotype, or do we see each other as who we really are? And I think that, back to the superpower of writing and culture, I think we want to come closer to seeing each other as we truly are.